Alrighty, hello everybody. Welcome to the Libertarian Federal Budget Response for 2024. I'm here joined by none other than the indomitable Dr. John Humphreys, co-founder of the then Liberal Democrats, now Libertarian Party, and chief economist of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I'm also joined by Charlie Rios, the newly minted Federal Secretary. I hope the seat was warm and comfortably accoutred. And Charlie, in addition to being a bit of an admin powerhouse behind the scenes, also does economic commentary for SBS in the Spanish language. So I think the Argentinians are obviously front of everyone's minds on economic commentary these days, and we can't wait to hear Charlie's thoughts. If you're joining us live, we'll be able to see the comments coming through. Please shout out, let us know if you've got any questions. Or anything you want to ask any of the panelists in particular, or any topics that you want us to address. We will have some predetermined stuff we want to go through, but if we can, either during the course of that or afterwards, we will address what you have to say. I'm Jordan Dittloff. I'm the lead Senate candidate for the Libertarian Party in Victoria, and it's great to have everyone here. So I know that as the lead economist of the ATA, John Humphreys probably already 24 hours deep is well and truly sick of talking about this budget. But John, I thought I'd begin by getting you to give your sort of high level overview. I was lucky enough very briefly in my lunch break today to catch a little bit of the ATA federal budget stream. And so I've got some idea of what your thoughts are, but for those who didn't, or for those who would be curious, I'd love to know a little bit more.
Yeah, g'day, Jordan. Great to be here, and g'day, Charlie, and hello to anyone listening at home. If you heard today's live stream, you would have heard that some of my compatriots. I think this is right. I found this budget quite boring. I apologize in advance if my internet down, so I'm just going to have to wait if that happens, so that I know. But I found this budget. And there's not a lot in it that you talk about. And the reason I say that is nearly everything that people are talking about aren't real topics. So the first thing people are talking about, the first thing the budget talks about, is tax cuts. These tax cuts are, 5 years old? These were legislated
so just before you go into tax cuts, I think your audio was a little bit matrix before when you're saying, so your position, I think, if I recall from the ATA stream, is that you think this is a very boring budget with very little to say.
Yes, and I'm saying the reason I know it hasn't got much to say is what they do say is largely bullshit. So the first thing is tax cuts, which are 5 years old, which they tweaked 6 months ago. So this is a very old story. The idea that that's the front page news, and then they go straight on to the next piece of news, which is they've got a surplus, which is last year's surplus. So the surplus is about 23-24. This is the 24-25 budget. I've been following budgets for about 25 years, ever since I went to work at the Commonwealth Treasury in the year 2000. Working in budget policy division, so I was very used to
a work environment that encouraged you to found the Libertarian Party, I believe. I recall.
Indeed, as a rebellion. But while working there, I got very used to how it works. And the year you're in, it's that year's budget that everyone focuses on, unless it just so happens that the government and the compliant media have an incentive to just randomly pick a different year that is more fun to focus. This year's budget is in surplus. That's nice. This year's budget has a $30 billion. And you have the 28.3 numbers on the fly. I'll just round it to 30. You see very few people focus on that. So that's the second thing to focus on is the full surplus. Then the energy rate. Focus on the energy rate, which they are going to put downward pressure, which is obviously bullshit, and everyone knows that isn't real. So that's a bit of a false argument to start with that. Might get some Labor true believers, but it's not a real argument, and it's not a real piece of reform. So there's nothing, and nothing. And then you look at the macroeconomics. It's bad, but it's not the worst in the world. So it's kind of what you expect. It's as disappointing as you would expect, but it's not much of a story.
So
and on the microeconomics, there's nothing there. Like, all of the important pieces of reform that this country actually needs to get on a better trajectory are entirely missing, as is any semblance of an inkling that they're even aware that they should start doing that. So there's not
Yeah,
much.
we'll come back to that. Absolutely, we've got a few comments. I'm not going to show every comment that criticises your internet, but there are a few cheeky folks in the chat suggesting that we need to prioritise fixing the NBN in Queensland, which might not be a particularly libertarian policy, but it could serve our interests tonight. Before I go to Charlie to sort of get your high level thoughts on what you think about this budget, I'll share my impressions, and I have to make this caveat. I'm absolutely not an economist by any stretch of the imagination, but I am very interested in obviously federal policy, and I have been following budgets similarly for a couple of years now. And I see this budget and really think that this is a budget that seems, if this was a budget reply from an opposition, we would probably call it a small target budget, right? Where it's essentially trying to make the possible targets for attack as weak or as small as possible. I'm not quite sure what we call it. We were talking about this a little bit before the stream started. I'm not sure what we call it when a government is doing the same thing. But I do think that this budget is, if not an attempt to be a Goldilocks budget where it's just right, there's something for everyone, and they can sort of be a chameleon and say, yes, we're fiscally responsible, but at the same time, yes, we care about cost of living and housing pressures and all these kinds of things. It really does feel as though this is a budget that might be designed to be a springboard or a platform to potentially an earlier election than we had thought. And there's a few kind of things floating around in the background that also point in that direction. And Charlie, I'll get your high-level thoughts as well. What are your takeaways, or what's your feel of the vibe of this budget?
Thanks, Jordan. Great to see you again, John. Honestly, the first thing that came to my mind after I saw all of the details, it's bread for today, hunger for tomorrow. It's just a massive sugar high. It's definitely what I would probably call a typical Labor budget, a liberal light budget. It's certainly a pre-election. Just throw money at everyone and hope that someone appreciates it and remembers you when they get to the polls. It's certainly not fiscally responsible once you uncover that first layer of, well, what happens in year two? And so, whoop, let's not talk about it. It's over $20 billion in deficit. That's just when you start peeling away, and as you get through the next few layers, it's that deficit continues to grow and the government debt gets worse and worse. But if you look at the structural changes that they've made just to NDIS, it's a great start, but they then top onto it some more expenditure. So I'm not impressed, but I guess it's what we would have expected from a typical Labor government that's looking forward to an election.
I heard today, and I wasn't expecting to hear it from this quarter, but Karl Stepanovic sometimes comes up with some absolutely brilliant ones, because I think people don't expect that he will. So when he does, it just like completely puts them like a deer in the headlights. Because Jim Chalmers was on it, and Karl Stepanovic said, "How does it feel to deliver your last surplus as federal treasurer?" And it was just brilliant, because he was just sitting there thinking he was going to be a puff piece, and from that point on, he just never recovered. It was actually one of the better interviews for a little while. But you're right. Like, I think it's definitely the Wizard of Oz stuff. Like, don't look behind the curtain. Nothing to see here. I do think that this certainly is a budget where they know there'll be an election before the next one. So this almost is an attempt by them to be the last word or the final argument. I did want to get your thoughts, John, on, I think the elephant in the room here is that in reality, as much as libertarians might view this as a very boring, very unambitious budget that doesn't really start the hard work that is to come, it has to be said that in comparison to the last couple of budgets the Liberal Party delivered, this is actually an objectively better budget that at least starts to take some positive steps.
You're going to have to help me out with identifying those positive steps here, I think, Jordan. I mean, it's like there's one positive thing I could say about this budget, and that is that they continued the instant asset write-off for small businesses with assets up to $20,000. But I've got three. That's like a half a pat on the back, because I've got three complaints about that. They're only continuing 1 year. It should be permanent. It's only up to 20,000. It should be up to much more, or just open-ended. And it's only up to pretty small businesses. It should cover medium-sized businesses at least. So that's very tepid support for one sort of half-assed Labor policy that only even lasts 1 year. So I found that it's not really structural reform. It's 1 year. Beyond that, to the degree that they attempted structural reform, that it was just picking winners, old school corporatism. I mean, Jim Chalmers did warn us about a year ago that he'd been taking economic advice from Benito Mussolini and Xi Jinping about the importance of merging the corporate sector with the state, which if you've read your 20th century political history, you'd recognize that idea. And he just basically came out and said that that's what he wants to achieve. And now he's taking some steps. We're in this slow slide towards embedded corporatism. And this budget moves us towards that a bit further, not at very quick speed, right? They're trying to claim $23 billion.
So you're talking about, for instance, picking winners in hydrogen technology, quantum technology, and some mineral resource mining. Is that right?
Yes, they're not even trying to actually just pick economic winners. They're trying to pick climate winners. So they're even hamstringing their ability to pick winners. But they've got their, what do they call it? Future Made in Australia plan, which is a bunch of picking winners of industries that they think will be needed in their future renewable utopia. So putting aside whether that will work itself, the other thing about that, it is a slow motion move to corporatism. They make a big song and dance about $23 billion. That's $23 billion over 10 years with nearly none of it showing up in the Ford estimate. So it's even their mistakes, they're doing slowly and tepidly and half-hearted. But you started this off with saying that they take steps in the right direction. I might have missed it. There was a few footnotes on page 621 I didn't get to. What was it, Jordan? What are the...
Yeah, look, I think it says something about the Morrison government that they can make, as you say, a tepid, very sort of boring budget look good. But my point, I think, is that they are positioning themselves politically or from a messaging point of view to say, look, we're being responsible. We're trying to be responsible. We're trying to, we're not just going all guns blazing. And, I can see that they're trying to protect themselves from the criticism that usually comes, of course, at a federal election from the Liberal Party, where they say the Liberals are better economic managers. I have no doubt, of course, that the Liberal Party will try to resurrect that pitch, but it's going to be much, much harder in the minds of voters. And I think the Labor Party kind of know that. And I think that they are trying to position themselves to, to sort of outflank the Liberals on economics. God help us all. But then I also think that they are obviously trying to be, like you said, with figures that almost disappear as rounding errors and are spread out over such a long amount of time that it's not going to make any difference. But they are trying to be able to say, listen, look, we hear you're hurting. We want to help you. So I can see, I've just put up as a highlight here, Cameron Smith says instant asset write-off gets treated like a plaything every year. It goes from 1K to unlimited to 20K, depending on the direction of the wind. Absolutely nothing in this budget for business. I think that's a pretty fair summation.
Well, there's some in this budget for big business that are well connected to bureaucrats and have the ear of the climate czar. So Twiggy Forrest is going to do well out of this. So some big businesses are going to get some big handouts if they are, when the government picks winners, if you're one of the ones that they're picking, that's great for you. But I mean, the point, of course, is economies aren't made by being pro-business. I mean, the important thing isn't to be pro-business, it's to be pro-market, because bad businesses should fail. New businesses should start all the time, and many of them will fail. And that's how the process is supposed to work. The idea isn't dogmatic allegiance to the current business people, which is, it seems to be, because Labor doesn't understand why anyone would support markets. When they try to fake imitating economic responsible party, they think all that involves is going and sucking up to some businessmen. But of course, that's not the way to have a dynamic market economy.
It is the way to get some funding for their party.
But, well, that is an unavoidable conclusion of suspicion. But one of the key things, obviously, that the Treasurer is spruiking front. So, well, the first thing he's spruiking is, as you say, taking responsibility for watered down tax cuts that were announced 5 years ago. The second thing that he is sort of keen to remind everyone of, or put front and center, is this much vaunted $300 per household. Although he doesn't quite say per household, it's per bill payer. So if you had a couple of houses, like, a holiday home or a beachfront home or whatever, it's actually per residence. And it is quite interesting the way they've rolled out this energy subsidy or, energy relief. What are your thoughts on this $300, I suppose, sugar hit, for want of a better word?
Do you want this one, Charlie, or... I mean,
look, yeah. Let's break it down, Jordan. Firstly, it's not $300; it's $75. It starts from 1st July, and you're getting it per quarter, it's not coming to you. It's going directly to the energy provider. So essentially, it will appear on the bill as $75 off. The finer detail, if it's it'd definitely be per bill. I'm not sure if they're going to be restricting it and cross-referencing it if it's per individual. John, do you have any? Have you seen any fine print on that?
I think it's the whole point of this is to make the bills look $75 cheaper per quarter, so they can pretend CPI inflation is
yes,
lower.
that's exactly what.
So,
yeah,
so I imagine
like
that's why it's been targeted towards wherever there is a bill, they will make it $75 lower. So that, well, yeah, which is why it's not means tested, and it's why, as you say before, that's probably the reason for his awkward wording.
Yes, very
bill.
much so. And yeah, he struggled to answer questions about that. And do you think this will fool the powers that be when it comes to?
I don't think. Surely Chalmers doesn't think it's going to fool the RBA. I mean, I don't think it's designed to do that.
Fooling people generally doesn't work well when you're telling them, unless it's like the hide in plain sight sort of, open hustle, Houdini thing where it's misdirection. He's so confident in his ability to hustle, he's just straight out telling them he's hustling them.
It'll probably fool the average voter, but it's certainly not going to fool the RBA, because if you look at what the RBA's recent statement said, what they wanted to see to lower inflation was lowering the cost of oil prices. And what's the first thing that can be done for oil prices for the cost of that is lowering excise.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, you were talking earlier before the stream began about how you think that this budget in some ways is designed to be a potential platform if the sort of economic winds blow the right way, and the Labor Party feel like there might be a couple of rate cuts that they can kind of take ownership of, claiming economic stewardship or whatever. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on unpack that a little bit more for the listeners and viewers.
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of commentary today about the potential political implications of this in the next federal election. I think they're leaving their options open. They would like to. They're hoping, and I think it's more hope than planning, because they've done nothing to actually achieve this. But dumb luck happens, right? It's a lot of this is up to luck. The governments pretend they control a lot of the things in the budget. They don't control most of the levers in the budget. And if luck goes their way, then Jim Chalmers will be hailed as an economic and political guru by the media that already love him anyway. But what they're hoping for is that inflation abates. It won't be due to this budget, but they're hoping inflation abates. They keep out of a nationwide recession. Of course, we've already been in a per capita recession for the last 12 months. And for some reason, the media is uninterested in the fact that Australians are getting poorer because some meaningless statistic is going up. But anyway, my complaints notwithstanding, it is still, I think that's the path they're trying to go. Avoid the GDP, the total country recession, get inflation down. If that's the case, by the end of the year, they'll be looking forward to some rate cuts. If they think the rate cuts are coming, I think they'll just hold off, wait for the rate cuts, and then call the election after that and claim. So
you still think that the likelihood of it being, say, March after a couple of favourable rate cuts, like maybe in December and February, you think a March to May election is still more likely in your view?
I think that, well, I don't know about more likely. I think that's what they're still hoping for. And then what we've got is the next national accounts coming out in a couple of months. You've got each couple of months a statement by the RBA. They'll be able to tell whether they're drifting into a full-on recession or whether inflation is getting out of their control. And if those things are getting out of their control and their dream scenario isn't working, they may decide to pull the election forward. But I think pulling the election forward would be a sign of desperation, because their original plan is starting to fail and they need to hurry up and get to the polls before the economy totally tanks. So,
yes. So Brett Eisen here says in the comments, and please, guys, continue to contribute and ask questions or make comments as you can from each of the platforms we're streaming from. So Brett says, when the Morrison government reduced excise during COVID, it did impact inflation overall. And I think we did see through COVID what they can do when they're sufficiently motivated. And yeah, look, you mentioned earlier, Charlie, the importance or the potential impact that excise reduction could have, not just at the petrol bowser, but also on tobacco and alcohol and almost all the other areas of excise that disproportionately target those who can least afford it. What do you think about Brett's comment with respect to excise and inflation?
Well, it's right to the point of what the RBA governor said, which is basically she wanted to see moving forward that a reduction in the price of oil, and the change in if they would have applied even a 50% reduction in excise, we probably would have been able to say, hand on heart, November we're going to get a interest rate cut, and everything's going to be hunky dory. Which means if they wanted to have an election after that, early in the new year, that'd be fantastic. With what they're giving us, which is bread and circuses, it's the market's reading it a lot less favorably. I don't think we're going to be seeing interest rate cuts this side of 2024. More than likely, maybe later in 2025. But that depends what happens, as John mentioned a moment ago, what the national accounts come up with, because we could see changes positively spinning the economy because of this future made in Australia, and everyone's all ramped up for it, or everyone could just be holding back their dollars and waiting for the next election.
So Benjamin Robson says that the most astounding thing to him about the budget was that Treasury actually exposed the consequences of bracket creep. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. John.
No, I smiled when I saw that comment come in, because that is actually a very good comment. It's a great point. Treasury actually has a table in one page dedicated to this issue, done exactly as I've been encouraging people to do it for the last year. Now, I'm going to take credit for it. They probably haven't read what I've written. They probably did it entirely independently, but I'm going to take credit anyway, because what they did is they separated out the different reasons for a revenue increase. And it could be due to inflation, in which case that's normal. Revenue goes up because inflation's gone up. That's part of life. More people in the country. All right, populations come in. Revenue goes up. That's the population comes in, it increases GDP. That's a normal reason for revenue going up. Why does it go up beyond those two reasons? There's some sort of structural factor that leads to automatic tax increases built into our system, the most obvious of which is bracket creep. And one of my suggestions in a paper I put around at the end of last year was that Treasury should be required to actually publish the 3 different causes of revenue increase. And any revenue increase that goes beyond inflation and population, the government should have to justify or give it back. And very interestingly, Treasury has now basically done the first part of this, and now it's up to us to hold the government to account. Hey, all of that extra revenue you're getting that can't be justified through population or inflation, why are you keeping it? Right? What are you doing that is so bloody good that justifies you stinging us $10 or $20 billion a year in this secret hidden tax increase? And I know when you're dealing with numbers this big, it can get very esoteric, especially listening at home without a whiteboard. You're just hearing us talk numbers that can go over your head quickly. Billion, not million, 1,000 million. All right. This is serious numbers. 10 billion. And that's not 10 billion once, $10 billion tax increase every year. Every year. If we're not getting a $10 billion tax cut every year, they're increasing your taxes. Right. And so that is now becoming clearer in the public conversation, and a bit of credit to Angus Taylor. He's been talking about it more. We'll see if he keeps talking about it if he gets into government, but at least in opposition, he's talking about it. And Treasury is
well, I'm certain Treasury is not talking about it for the reasons that we're excited about, but it is nevertheless an exciting development to see. I wanted to move on a little bit to discussion around housing, because this one to me always strikes me as a very mysterious thing for federal government to be talking about and spruiking in a federal budget, because essentially, even in their statement 4, they just concede that it's something they have no power over, and all they can do is sluice money around back to the states in order to try to incentivize them to build houses. But it's a bit of a South Park underpants gnomes kind of logic, where it's like, money plus question mark equals housing. Like, it's very, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it and understand how this could even conceivably result in improvement in something that is fundamentally very much a state and council issue.
Is that to Charlie? Or?
Yeah, well,
sure.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Charlie's thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Look, budget paper number 4, statement 4 says, budget paper number 1, statement 4, basically says the government's going to pump in 30 billion, or what is it, 32 billion plan for new initiatives for 1.2 million houses. Okay, that's lovely, but when you do the math, it's roughly $30,000 for each new house, because when you consider how much a house costs to build from scratch, you're talking $300,000-400,000, more closer to the higher end, and that's less than 10%. So how are they going to build $1.2 million with, say, 8% of the cost of that house? It's improbable. It's just not going to happen. The only way that it's going to happen is if the private sector puts money in, and I don't see anyone. And the only way the private sector would do that is if it's economically viable, if they're going to get something out of it. Javier Milei in Argentina, in less than 6 months, improved housing affordability, or at least rentals, by 20%. And what did he do? He liberalized the market. Just let the market deal with it. So people that had homes to rent out and renters that wanted to rent a home, they basically came together, and because of the supply and demand, what ended up happening, prices dropped. So I think it's a lost opportunity that we've had here in Australia. We could liberalize it, and we'd not have to spend billions of dollars for rental support, or money injected into the states to build new houses. The market would sort itself out.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting in recent weeks. I've been speaking as part of my campaign with the YIMBY movement here in Melbourne, doing some policy briefing and sort of trying to understand from them what could be helpful from a federal level. And one of the things they mentioned is the unintended consequence, almost certainly, of tighter foreign investment restrictions on residential housing, basically causing investment and money for new residential medium density and high density developments basically drying up overnight. And that's almost certainly not what the intended mischief or consequence of those sort of tightening of restrictions was designed to do, but it has had a huge flow-on impact on the availability and financing for housing developments. And I can't recall which state, I think it might have been New South Wales, actually was making moves to either incentivise or ease some things in that area. John, what are your thoughts on the federal government and their contribution to housing, or sort of even notional involvement in housing as an issue? Should we have a federal Department of Housing?
Well, no, clearly that should be shut down immediately. Look, to some degree...
That was obviously a rhetorical question in this room, and I think for most viewers, but yes, if we had a whiteboard, we were referring things right now, I think the Federal Department of Housing would be very high on the list.
But this is to some degree an insidious political trick and a trap for most mainstream politicians, because the public is not acutely aware of the split of responsibilities between local, state, and federal governments. Realistically, the federal government doesn't have much power to fix this problem. It's very much a state and local issue, and they have ownership of the mistake, and they need to fix the mistake. But of course, the voting public, when they get angry and upset about house prices, which they have a right to be, quite frankly, then they blame politicians, which makes sense as well, and they're correct. It's a politician to blame. And then there's a federal election coming up. Most voters don't necessarily nuance who they're blaming. They're throwing mud, and there's a politician standing in their way. So I can understand the federal politician's instinct is, we've got to try and do something. But it's like that old skit, you've got to do something. This is something, so this must be done. There's not much the federal government can realistically and meaningfully do, other than potentially allowing people to use their superannuation for a house, which is one idea that's floating around. But that really goes to more of a question of superannuation reform than housing reform, which is really changing the topic a little bit here.
The libertarian position is that people should be able to use their superannuation for everything.
Yes, well, and the idea is a way to get that given in the door, a foot in the door, which allow people to use their super for buying a house, and then maybe buying a business, and then maybe saving for a university or their health costs. I think my out again is
just while Dr. John emerges from the abyss that is Queensland's internet connection once more, I've noticed Brett Eisen in the chat asking, looking to understand more from Charlie in particular about what were the key ingredients, or what kind of steps were taken to liberalise the housing market in Argentina, and in what way did the status quo prior to Milei coming to power differ from our position? My understanding was that it was much more like a Max Chandler Matters type of housing market, where there was a lot more restrictions and rental caps and all these kinds of distortionary effects. But I'd love to hear more about what it was like before and what reforms Milei made.
basically, if you take what the press has said and what all of the statements that have come from the presidential spokesman and the president himself, the idea was essentially get rid of all the bureaucracy, let renters and landlords come together and make a decision about what the rent's going to be, how long their contract's going to be for, and let them deal amongst themselves. I mean, that dealt with the rental market. I don't think there's massive reforms yet with respect to the construction of houses, because in Argentina it's slightly different. You might have to deal with the local council, but local council isn't as intrusive as it is here. My next door neighbor was building a duplex and he had to spend $150,000 for water controlling of the water courses, which seems absolutely crazy. $150,000 for a new home. On top of the new home, as John mentioned, yes, it is definitely local council is the big impediment to the housing market. It's also state government releasing land. It's state government with giving incentives. If we look to Queensland, what are they doing? Throwing money around just like Albanese is. So basically, if we take the libertarian approach and government steps away and lets individuals do what they want with their property, whether it be that they rent it out at a price that someone else will pay for it, or if they want to build something that, so long as it doesn't destroy the area. For example, you're not going to build a 10-story apartment in a residential area where the highest house is 2 stories. But obviously that's something logical that you wouldn't do that. You might want to, but you'd probably want to be friendly with your neighbors and tell them, look, I'm thinking of building, going to make a bit of noise. I'm at the moment getting my bathroom redone, and that's the first thing I did. Went and knocked on every door, left a letter on everyone's mailbox saying, hey, I'm going to be making a bit of noise. If there's any problems, give me a call. Not one person called, but thankfully there wasn't a lot of noise. So it's just being a good human and not getting in anyone's way. If the government did that, removing that red tape, we'd certainly improve all of the markets.
Absolutely, and I think your finishing comments there on red tape absolutely align with what Simon's talking about here in the highlighted comment I've just made. And I see this every day in my work. I'm working as a law graduate in a firm that does a lot of civil litigation, and a lot of the disputes we're dealing with are residential tenancies, construction disputes, these kind of areas. And what we're seeing is a logical but theoretically unintended consequence of trying to pressure landlords essentially into selling their homes to first home buyers. But in regional areas of Victoria, like Ballarat, where I live, the rental vacancy rate is 1%. So people are waiting up to 12 months to secure a rental. There's huge queues. People are, because obviously this pressure and scarcity creates incentives to attempt to skip the queue or better the offer. And so you get people offering to pay 6 to 12 months rent up front. All these kinds of things that are just a natural consequence of limiting the development of new supply while also turbocharging demand, and through regulation, making the prospect of being a landlord and having an investment property so undesirable in a state like Victoria that I know a number of people interstate who work in capital investment and other areas. And as soon as a project is flagged as being in Victoria, they're just like, no, I'm not interested.
Jen, so risking the internet dropping out again, I'd like to amend my previous comment. There is one obvious role that the federal government has in the housing situation. One of the reasons house prices are so high, I mean, one is there's the zoning and planning. We've kind of touched on that already, but also just the cost of supply significantly. What they
I'd say that probably has to be the best freeze frame of the night in terms of the facial expression as well. Sorry, just try one more time. We had a good 10 seconds at the beginning. So 10-second elevator pitch, what were you saying?
The cost of supply, the cost of building the house, because the government keeps sucking in all the resources and construction workers to build power lines to the... I've lost again, aren't I? I'd say the renewable energy. Renewable energy is sucking up all of the resources, the input costs, all the construction workers, as is working on stadiums and other things. If the government wanted to free up resources to build houses, they need to stop paying the exact same resources to go and build other things.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think one of the big factors that I've been talking about whenever I've been talking about housing in lives and other things since beginning my candidacy is the fact that there is no magical supply of resources or labour or, the government, all government infrastructure and government infrastructure builds, whether it be for energy or whether it be for, the Victorian big build, it all comes at the cost of private endeavour. The availability of labour, the availability of resources and materials, it's all completely distorted by those activities. So I totally agree with you. And at the end of the day, if you could be a labourer or a trade working on a domestic home, but you could be getting paid 3 times the money on a union site working for the government, why would you build a domestic home? So I think that's absolutely true. I wanted to come to a great comment that I saw that very neatly segues into what I wanted to talk about next, and some of the comments you've made. I think that your kind of first almost gut reaction that I saw on Twitter and wholeheartedly, sorry, X now, and we've officially moved across to X for the actual URL. Good on you, Elon. I don't know how much you paid. Someone grabbed a letter of the alphabet speculatively many years ago, no doubt, probably cashed in massively. But I think productivity is the real silent casualty of this budget, and obviously for many budgets preceding, and we can't just blame the Labor Party for back to the death of work choices, almost as I think in my mind, that's almost the point at which meaningful productivity reform seemed to become, something you shouldn't talk about, and something that both major parties, the Labor Party fundamentally doesn't believe in productivity, but the Liberal Party, I think, does, and have fled the field with their tail between their legs. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about, what are the missed opportunities, what things we should be doing, and what will happen if productivity isn't fixed. Because I think that's, it's hard to explain to people before the consequences of continually declining productivity manifest. But I think it is one of the biggest challenges of any government.
Is that coming to the guy with no internet or to Charlie?
Look, I'd love to hear Charlie's thoughts. We'll see how your internet goes. If you can kill a couple of programs in the background.
You go first, John.
Okay. I think you're right that productivity has fallen off the agenda. I would go back to before work choices. I know firstly, I've got a qualm with work choices. It centralized IR legislation, which I think was a fundamental mistake in the first place. But that's really going back. We've had no real productivity reform in about 20 years, I would argue. The only piece of that even halfway counts was the stage 3 tax cuts, right? Which we've been talking about for 5 years, and it's not that big a reform. We talked before about the bracket creep going up 10 billion each year. The stage 3 tax cuts, once modeled properly, will cut tax by about $10 billion, which is good. That's great. I would definitely take a $10 billion tax cut, but that's only 1 year of bracket creep. We've had bracket creep for 20 years. So the only piece of productivity reform has been giving us back 1 year of bracket creep. That's not a glowing endorsement of the productivity record over the last 20 years of both sides of government, including, quite frankly, the last term of the Howard government wasn't great on taking productivity reform seriously. Look, another little thing on this. Firstly, as you know, we've had a per capita recession for the last year. I would say the more worrying statistic is that productivity hasn't gone up for the last 8 years. We're at the same level of labor productivity in this country that we were 8 years ago. Now, ABS statistics go back, 60, 70 years. This is the longest period of productivity stagnation in the history of ABS statistics on this issue. So this is a record-breaking stagnation of productivity. What's the consequences of that? As Matt Canavan was saying to me today when we were talking about this issue, everyone's eyes glaze over when you say productivity. Is the only reason you can have wage increases. And my internet's probably going down again, so I'll say it again. Productivity is the only reason you can ever have wage increases without price increases. It's the only reason you can have real wage increases, the only reason you can have more prosperity. If you want more prosperity, if you want to solve inflation without having a recession, you need productivity. You want real wage growth with causing inflation, you need productivity. And yet it's been entirely missing from the debate. I'd say 3 core parts of what you do. This is brackets. These aren't specific policy areas, but 3 things you need to think about when you want to talk about improving productivity. You need your income taxes down, all taxes down preferably, but really it's the income taxes that you need to get down. And you need to have Regulations, especially regulations on small business and new business, because what you need is new businesses entering the market all the time, right? We're not trying to make things a little bit easier for the big business. We're trying to make sure small businesses and new businesses are always able to come up with new ideas, enter the market, add competition to the market. And the third one is energy prices. And it seems like it's very little progress on any three of these fronts. We're going backwards on energy prices. We're trying to regulate energy to death so that we all have to pay a bit more so that we can defeat the sun in an arm wrestle. Regulation, no one's really taking seriously. And tax, we've had one tax cut, but that's, as I said, 1 year of bracket creep. Give us the other 19 years back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you look at the way this government in particular, but as you've said, as you've rightly said, I think it's become kind of a bipartisan thing. It's almost as though to infer that we could be being more productive and that there is any benefit or that we should desire greater productivity almost seems to be akin to some sort of long forgotten heresy. You know, people, it's almost like it would be an insult to Australians to infer that we might perhaps be becoming less productive. And I think if we look at things like flexible working from home arrangements and many of the other things that have begun to become more commonplace in terms of work practices and other things, I think it would be difficult to justify the argument that we are not, in fact, working less hard for more money. So I think that's something that only the Libertarian Party, I believe, really has anything to say about these issues. As I said, the field has been ceded by the Liberal Party. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Charlie, and from an Argentinian perspective as well. What do you think? What do you think that we could do or should do to help boost productivity?
Look, Argentina is one of those very interesting countries, much like Australia, that used to make everything that it needed. It was self-sufficient. Australia used to produce its own steel, used to produce fuels. We'd mine things and we'd make things out of it. We had a strong manufacturing arm. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is because it was cheaper to buy certain products from other countries, we won't name them, we ended up buying from them, and down went the manufacturing, so less productivity. And Argentina's main productivity comes from farms. So basically farms, meat, wheat, everything, all primary materials. And much like Australia, which our mining industry is booming. But unfortunately, what happens with that is that if you're not producing anything with that, you're losing a lot of that value add. And Argentina, much like Australia, is suffering that effect. But what ended up happening in Argentina is that the government saw that the main productivity was coming from these areas, so started to overtax it. So if we think of the mining resources tax that former governments wanted to put in, basically that would have killed off the mining industry like it's did in Argentina to the farming and production. They basically decided, well, let's just sit back and see what happens, and everything just went to hell. Now, fortunately, Malay is in place and is seeing that there's benefit in lowering taxes, making their lives easier, so that that will obviously increase and drive productivity, much like what John was saying, that's one of the factors that you need: favorable tax concessions, or at least some tax concessions that make it livable, that you can earn a profit. And it's not exactly booming because the government's only been there for 7 months, or just under 7 months. But you can't build Rome in a day. But fortunately, Malay has done some miracles as a libertarian in less time than most governments have in 2 terms. In Argentina, the terms are for 4 years. Here, they're for 3. So unfortunately, we have another problem here in Australia, that the government's, or the federal government, is very short-sighted. They're looking at 3 years. So their first year is their honeymoon. The second year, they can do some change. And the third year, they're waiting for what are they going to give everyone for their election. So I don't think we can see any. I'd even go further back than John and say we haven't really seen any productivity improvements or something that's going to drive that productivity change since the Accord, which we're talking the mid 80s there. And every time when I started reading this budget, the first thing that came to mind is we're past 1990 and Australian children are still living in poverty. So Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, shame on you, that never came true. I mean, politicians are quite aspirational. They'd love things to go their way, and productivity is certainly one of those things that we need. But as John mentioned, we also need some stability with the government. We need them to be more forward-looking on tax and reform it so that it's not such a burden.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just noticed it. So I had on the screen there from Indemnity the kind of tongue-in-cheek thing. Maybe we should if we're at the Productivity Commission. I think that's a bit rough. I think they're kind of screaming into the void. I think that one of the most depressing places to have worked in recent years in the public service in Canberra would be in the Productivity Commission. I can just imagine there might well be a few good targeted converts to the Libertarian Party in the Productivity Commission, I suspect. But I think that the comment just now from Brett is very true as well. And I think that the idea that the public service is somehow operating at 100% efficiency, or that there's no fat to cut from the public service, is obviously a nonsense. And I think that it's fair to say, I think our official policy is that we should have a 10% efficiency dividend on public service, but I think it could be, even a lot higher than that without making any noticeable difference to the services, particularly at a federal level where, as we've already talked about in other areas like housing, the federal government's role is essentially just to hoover up money from the states because of the fiscal imbalance that exists in the way our constitution's federalism has been interpreted by the High Court, and then just disperse it via watering can, at will. And I think that there really does need to be some serious effort to rein in the growth of the public service. And again, we've talked about this period in time as the wellspring from which many negative trends in Australian government seems to have emerged. And unfortunately, it is the last term of the Howard government that saw the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet just explode. And I just don't think we've looked back since then. Do you think, Dr. John, that there should be greater attention to productivity measures in the public service?
I'm going to approach this a slightly different way. I'm sure you can get more productivity out of the public service. My bigger concern, if anything, I think the public service probably is better for us when they have lower productivity, because I think they are a net negative in most of the things they do. So if they could do those things more slowly, we might all be better off. Now, that's only somewhat facetious, tongue-in-cheek. I guess I'm saying they should be slashed, but productivity isn't really my motivation there. My motivation is that I worry the degree to which the entrenched bureaucracy are running nearly all policy directions in this country. And we have this pantomime of thinking that we're voting for political leaders that are choosing policy. The bureaucrats are writing the policy, and then they just write it in a different color ink, depending on whether it's a Liberal or Labor government. And then the Liberal or Labor government introduces it to the voting public. Look at my policy. It wasn't your policy. It was the bureaucrats that came up with it, sold to the same policy no matter who got in power. And then we had the illusion of choice. And I think this is to some degree because each department has thousands of people giving advice to one very stressed minister with 2 staffers. And that minister's probably got a PhD on how to get elected, but a grade 2 education on how to do policy. And so they need help in policy. And then they've got thousands of very smart people in very fancy suits knocking on their door and saying, this is what you have to do or you're an idiot. And most ministers cave to that. And probably understandably, given the situation they're in. So we're going to need to change that dynamic. And the only way I can think of doing it is we have to massively weaken the public service, or just accept that the public service are going to run a technocracy for the foreseeable future. So it gets to the same point, slash and burn,
So I've put up a highlighted comment here from Richard, and knowing Richard as I do, I'm fairly confident that this is a satirical comment. So Monique Ryan calls for an Argentinian approach, fast tracking of large-scale solar and wind projects to accelerate Australia's transition to net zero, taxing multinational fossil fuel companies properly by modifying the PRRT, and stopping approvals of new coal and gas projects. So thank you. I think Richard might actually still be overseas. I received a message from him the other day in front of an overseas nuclear power plant. So I hope, Richard, if you are overseas, you're enjoying your travels. And thank you for joining us at what might be a more reasonable time during the day for you, wherever you are. I think while we're on renewables a little bit, this does, as you pointed out, Dr. John, across like many areas of the budget, it does seem to be this real sort of black hole, inexorable focus that everything else seems to be aligning around and drawn from. You mentioned in one of your ex posts that there were a lot of things that were almost sort of hidden or off to the side, off budget. And I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about what that means. I suspect there might be some costs and renewables potentially in that mix, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, well, technically it's not off budget because you can find the information in the budget. It's just not included in the underlying cash balance, which is what everyone reports as being the budget balance. So this is the same trick the government did last year when they decided their housing policy, when they put $10 billion into the housing policy and it impacted the budget zero. Because what they did is they bought a financial asset. And when the government buys a financial asset, it doesn't show up in the budget because they're using cash as a financial asset and they're using one financial asset to buy another. It's just changing the column in a spreadsheet. It doesn't actually change the budget, which is a bit of a trick because they are changing the public policy. So there's a category called changes in financial assets done for policy reasons. And that doesn't show up in the underlying cash balance. It does show up in the headline cash balance. And you can see we talked about a $30 billion deficit. It's actually a $50 billion deficit in the headline cash balance when you look at changing financial assets for policy reasons. I know this is very wonky, but I worry about it. This not just for the reason of transparency, but there is a growing pool of money that the government controls that no one pays too much attention to. And the assumption is that they invest this money. It's a financial asset, so they're investing it. They're making loans. They're buying equity. And if they're doing that for the purpose of making a return and then use that return to buy something good, I still don't like the idea, but you can see why others might. Increasingly, the government's financial assets are being used to achieve policy ends such as only investing in certain types of renewable energy. And this puts a very significant thumb on the scale in a way that doesn't show up on the budget papers as a policy measure. But it does show up when you're out there looking to make an investment in which sort of energy generator to produce. And one of them is getting subsidized funding from a massive government entity, a government financial provider. And the other ones are basically being blackballed by all the banks. And this is significantly warping our energy infrastructure in ways that I think needs more attention. Perhaps what we need to do is simply trust the government a lot less to be allocating our capital. The government allocating capital, I thought we learned that lesson around about, was it 1991, 1989? When did the Berlin Wall fall? 89. The government is not great at allocating capital, but we've got more and more money going into these things that are basically the equivalent of the future fund. Now, the future fund hasn't been overly politicized yet, but I don't trust it. The super funds are going to be politicized. There's too much allocation of capital that is very susceptible to political interference. And some of it already has an explicit requirement that it has to be politically allocated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the government talks a lot, I've noticed, about certain types of energy having lost their social license. And I think it would be more true to say that they've had their social license completely torn up and shredded by the government of the day. So to sort of say, oh, look, you Simon Holmes Accords and others to say, oh, look, there's this real inflow of capital, or the market's choosing this. It's like, yes, that's because you've got a gun to the head of the market going, well, you know what the right decision is. Can
I give you one other example of that? There's $7 billion in this budget being announced that's going to Snowy Hydro. Doesn't show up in the budget bottom line because it's going as loans and equity investments. So it's going as a financial asset. So it doesn't show up in the budget bottom line, but that's $7 billion of money that the government has to borrow. They have to borrow that money so they can lend it out to their pet project. So it's $7 billion
now. Don't worry, I guarantee you that figure will go up. It's just like $7 billion so far. So I think just one quick detour that this is certainly not a headline budget issue, but this is something that I'm personally quite interested in. One of my law focuses or specialties is on international commercial arbitration and investment arbitration, which is when private companies and sometimes states and investors basically resolve their disputes by private contract. So they don't deal with the courts of a particular state because there's often a lot of distrust and a lot of power imbalance, and investors rightly worry that as John just used that wonderful phrase, that the scales are going to have a finger put on them by the government, the host government of the investment. And we usually think about investors having their assets nationalized and their property rights infringed in the context of such great states as Venezuela and Brazil and many other sort of glorious beacons of prosperity and capitalism. But in recent times and through COVID, we actually had the dubious pleasure of joining those ranks in Australia, and we saw the WA state government, and then sort of retroactively supported by the federal government, nationalising assets of Clive Palmer's Australian mineral resources through his company Mineralogy. Now, what they didn't realise at the time they did that was that Clive had structured his businesses quite cleverly in such a way that his mineralogy company in Australia was a wholly owned subsidiary of his Singaporean-owned company called Zeph. And Singapore and Australia have an investment treaty that gives quite strong protections and investor-state arbitration mechanisms to investor states. So we have what I think, just from a libertarian trolling point of view, is probably one of the most glorious sort of battles that will be unfolding in the next year or so, where Clive Palmer, through his Singaporean company vehicle, is suing the Australian government under a foreign investment treaty. And I'm just going to share screen here a little bit to show you what that could look like, because I noticed in the last budget they had it listed as I think it was a remote unquantifiable contingent liability. It has now progressed to be a unquantifiable contingent liability. So it has become significantly less remote. And I'm just going to share a little bit about that story. So I hope everyone can see. Obviously, we've got Clive there. We love to see him, Uncle Clive. Big thumbs up. And as it turns out, it's actually not that unquantifiable. It's unquantifiable because they'd rather not think about how much it is, but it's very quantifiable to the tune of $300 billion. So in the circumstances of a budget where nearly all of the announcements, as John Humphreys mentioned, are like tiny, almost not even rounding errors, this is a incredibly significant, completely self-inflicted liability that I think may well, knowing what I do about investment arbitration and having been in a few circles who have talked about this, where I've got friends who work in the arbitration field in WA and in AKICA, which is the peak body for Australia, and others, talking about Clive's prospects sort of off the record, and basically saying that if he has structured his company well, and the people around Clive are often very smart, even if Clive himself doesn't always make the best decisions unassisted, but they basically think there's really very little way the Australian government can sort of ride out of the consequences of the actions they've taken. So we obviously don't want to see any more taxpayer money getting wasted than we have to, but it would be pretty spectacular to see this eventuate. And the Australian government basically can't even kind of stack the deck. They can't pick the judges, or they get to pick one arbitrator. Clive gets to pick an arbitrator, and then those two together pick a third independent arbitrator. So the government will be sweating bullets on this one. I'm not sure whether this will happen in the next 12 months, the next 18 months, but I watch that at least with a great personal sense of satisfaction and interest. So yeah, it sort of also has led to Clive being quite distracted, relatively speaking, when it comes to Australian domestic politics. So if anyone's been wondering where he's been at, he's probably been rubbing his hands together with glee, fighting the government in a different arena.
Can I give a context to the size of that number, 300 billion? The current net debt for the Australian government, a lot of people have been worried about the rising net debt, and it's getting up there. The current net debt is 500 billion. So if they now have to pay Clive 300, that is 60% again of all current net debt from all previous.
Yeah, I saw your facial expression when I said 300 billion, and I knew that must be significant. So look, what Clive Palmer would do with $300 billion, which is significant even for him, God only knows. But that will remain something just of personal interest to me as I watch the budget going forward. So I'd like to... Please.
Yeah, thanks. We kind of got off of away from the topic of the budget balance. It occurred to me there was something about the budget balance that I wanted to mention. if we have a moment for it. I said before, we're in a deficit of about $28 billion in the current year. And often the refrain is thrown back to people, oh, well, what do you want to cut? If you don't want to have a deficit, what do you want to cut? There's one interesting little fact for you. Since the Labour Party came in, just for that budget year, so 2024-25, for the last 2 years, Labour has announced, just for that budget year, $31 billion worth of new spending. They've announced 31 billion in that. So if Labour had simply kept all previous spending, right, not done any of the reform they need to do, and they should do that reform, but if they hadn't done any reform and they had just done nothing, they'd gone to play golf every weekend instead of coming up with new stupid policies, they could have actually put down a surplus. So I think it's remarkable how many times I look at a budget and that comes true, that if the government could just withhold their addiction to other people's money, they could just, go cold turkey for 1 year, or in this case, 2 years, they could actually balance the budget that they say is impossible to balance.
Yeah, it is a little bit like, a child with their hand on the hot stove saying, ouch, it hurts, it burns, and then just not taking their hand off the hot stove. It is a compelling metaphor, I think, to imagine. And I heard you say that at the last Freedom Conference I heard you speak at, to say that, yeah, if government only simply froze expenditure, we obviously argue they should do far more than that. But even if they were not as ambitious or not as cognizant of the cliffs we face, and I think you're right, going forward, it's a horror show after the next 12 months, basically. And I think that, it's going to get... Look, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts about this, because my gut instinct is that we probably won't be able to avoid a technical recession. I feel it's at least as likely as not that we will go down that path. And regardless of what the books say, we will be experiencing it, and that's what we do know, is that the community will be feeling as though, like, we're already starting to feel that, like, that there is that sort of stench of death in the air, economic death in some ways. And what we saw through COVID is that consumer confidence is such a finely honed thing that it can really swing very quickly. What do you think the next couple of years will look like if we ignore election cycles, and if we imagined that we were responsible politicians who were thinking long term? What do you think the next couple of years will look like, and what do you think some consequences of that could be?
Yeah, the trick with forecasting is that people who know what's going to happen won't tell you, and people who are telling you don't know. So take anything anyone says with a healthy grain of salt about what's coming next. There's so many moving parts that realistically you can't know with too much certainty what's going forward. Look, I think there's a chance we avoid what you call a technical recession. I don't know if it matters that much. We have been going backwards. People, on average, have been getting poorer for 12 months in a row now. So people are already feeling it. And what comes next, so much of it is up to dumb luck that then politicians either take credit for or get blamed for. And there is a chance that they just dumb luck their way through into never actually having 2 quarters in a row of negative GDP. So I'm not putting anything on that. My argument is, why does that matter? Surely GDP per person matters infinitely more than GDP. I mean, there's 2 reasons you'd worry about either of those metrics. If you're worried about gearing up for a shooting war and you need to buy tanks and planes, then GDP is the metric you need to worry about. If you're worried about the well-being of the people in your country, obviously it's GDP per person. Obviously, you need the per person metric, because that's how well off people are. I mean, you'd want actually even better than that. You'd want the GDP per hour worked, so that you factor in how much work people have to do. But I'm probably getting too technical when I do that. But we've already been going backwards. That's bad enough. We don't need a meaningless statistic to show up 2 quarters in a row for people to be upset. As for what comes next, I thought you were going to ask what comes next, fiscally speaking, which might be a bit easier. They've got 30, then 40, then $30 billion deficits, which of course you can't believe, because that's only true if we think the government could successfully get through a year without spending more money, which every year kind of disproves that. There was, by the way, I think it's 12 billion spent in the last 6 months, just in this budget year, 11.7 billion, just in this budget year.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And one thing that I think really, we sort of come to it at sort of the hour mark, but I think it's probably the most important thing we'll talk about tonight. We need to talk about debt. And I think that is the great sort of unspoken elephant in the room in this budget, and probably almost certainly the forward budgets. What is our debt position really? What metrics should we be looking at? They talk about gross debt and net debt. They say that gross debt will fall by like 0.2% over the forward estimates, which probably just means they were making bad forward estimates. But then they say, even according to their figures, that net debt will rise. What are the implications of that? What is Australia's credit rating, and how could that change? And what would the consequences be of not making meaningful inroads into reducing federal debt?
There are so many wonky parts of a correct answer here. One is the best metric is federal budget doesn't, so net financial worth. Internet isn't. I know. Net financial worth would be the metric higher than wonky. GDP isn't necessarily going to go up. That depends on what happens to GDP. As I'm prone to saying, I don't know if you can still hear me. I'll just keep talking as if you can. As I'm prone to saying on this, the current debt level, it's unfortunate, but it's not going to destroy the country. What I worry far more than the current debt level is the trajectory. And the trajectory isn't just the fact that even in good times, they run a $30 billion, even in good times, they run a $30 billion deficit, which is growing in the future. And then we know it's going to grow because they know they're going to spend more. And we know there's going to be downturns. But we've got the aging population. And the aging population is going to mean fewer and fewer taxpayers and more people falling back on, well, not just the age pension, because that might be solvable by just simply extending their retirement age, but healthcare. You're not going to really solve the fact that older people need more healthcare very easily by extending the retirement age. So that is going to put stronger and stronger pressures on the budget. At the same time, the NDIS is just ripping holes in the budget. And can you imagine which politician from the major parties is going to go to the public and say, we're going to have to wind back the age pension, Medicare, and disability support? Can you think of 3 harder sales pitches for a populist, or by populist, I mean someone who's going for 50% plus one politician to take to the public? I mean, it takes a brave politician or a minor party to be able to say such honest things to the public. But at some point, if they don't address those, these deficits are going to get worse to the future. And eventually we're going to be on a path of no return. As for what the consequences are, somebody that knows Argentina well would be well positioned to tell you what the consequences are of runaway debt.
Yes, Charlie, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What is increasing inflation, increasing debt? What would that look like for Australia? And I think there'll be parts of Australia, obviously, that will feel it first. And I think Victoria, as someone made the comment, I think Chuck in the chat made the comment, Victoria, I think, will be the first to sort of almost approach, this sort of failed state type of mantle. It's not something I'm looking forward to or proud of if it does happen. But what does that actually look like? Were you living in Argentina at a time when that did sort of start to happen, or?
Well, fortunately, I've always lived in Australia, but I've moved to, well, I've traveled through Argentina for extended periods of time. And I can certainly tell you that even the poorest person here in Australia that's living in a car is probably doing it better than some people in Argentina. I remember the times when people were wheeling wheelbarrows full of cash once they got their money, their salary, their monthly salary. And the first thing that they would do is go and buy sugar, flour, just basic staples that wouldn't you could resell onwards or resell in portions. So we're certainly not at that stage here in Australia that it's that bad. Yeah, sure, some people are living in cars. That's unfortunate. But in Australia, the general population is generally able to feed themselves. In Argentina, there's currently 60% of people living under the poverty line. Has Milei turned it around? He's trying. Unfortunately, there is also food banks where basically sometimes the army goes and prepares these trucks and they prepare giant meals for people to come and have a meal. In schools in Argentina, the students get at least breakfast and sometimes lunch. We don't have that situation here in Australia where kids have meals at school because of necessity. Yeah, sure, some kids sometimes get to school without having had breakfast. We're getting there, but it's certainly nowhere near as bad as Argentina has been in the past. Hyperinflation pre-2000 in Argentina was terrible. Now it's substantially worse, but it's been hidden because of the former government. Is the $1 trillion debt that Australia is going to have substantial? Yes, absolutely. And like John was mentioning, the aging population is certainly something that's going to come into play. Are we going to be in a state like Argentina is? Probably highly unlikely. Is Victoria going to be like that? Probably unlikely, because the Commonwealth will jump in and save them, I'd suspect. But at the end of the day, you've got politicians implementing bad policy that isn't sufficiently transparent. They're not held to account. You can't hold a politician to account and just say, "Oh, we'll vote them out next election," because the red party or the blue party or the green party or the purple party, whatever party you've got, it still has the same ideology of maintaining the same bureaucracy, applying the same tools. They've only got a hammer and a screwdriver, and that's how they think that they're going to fix the economy. It's and the same thing happened in Argentina. The same thing happens across the world. It's thankfully Argentina's seen the light and voted in a libertarian president. And the first thing that he went to do is cut and slash all of the departments that weren't required. The big issue in Argentina, however, is that we have these people called gnocchis. So in Argentina on the 29th, everyone has a plate of gnocchis. So you're reaching the end of the month, the 28 days, and gnocchis are made out of potato and flour, so it's a very cheap meal to make ends meet. So then you eat that. So they call someone who basically turns up once a month to get paid a gnocchi. And
that's absolutely glorious. I love that. I was wondering where that was going. It was better than I thought it was going to be.
Yes, but the end of the day, what ended up happening is Malay wanted to get rid of all of these people. So he's not firing them. What he's no longer doing is continuing their contracts. So a lot of these people are saying, "Oh, we're being fired. We're being fired." Well, no, you're no longer being rehired. And in that way, all of these gnocchis or superfluous staff that aren't required are being let go. Anyone that he has said very clearly, anyone that is producing for the government as part of the bureaucracy can stay, so long as they continue to produce and do something productive within the government. It's that unproductive side of it that is basically pushing papers from one side to the other. That's not productive.
Like if you almost apply the kind of logic that Dr. John was talking about before with new spending to the public service as well, if you simply just, as we have an aging workforce, that the public sector is no different to that, if you simply did not fill vacancies and kind of almost had like a sort of a shadow efficiency dividend, I think that would probably in Australia be politically the best way to achieve some of those goals. I think that when it comes to productivity and when it comes to debt, I think that both major parties and certainly the Greens as well, if you want to call it a tripartite sort of mainstream politics in Australia, I think that they really are, I don't know if anyone, it might date me age-wise, that this was like kind of a formative story that I remember growing up, but the magic pudding was a beautiful Australian sort of children's tale where, you had this pudding that just, it would be whatever flavour pudding you wanted and it would always just magically replenish. And so it was literally an all-you-can-eat pudding. It was a magic pudding. And I think that my term for the way I think about our current political discourse is this magic pudding economics, where we're dealing with political parties and a political culture that thinks there are no trade-offs, that thinks we can basically struggle along without actually making sacrifices or choosing between options or making hard decisions. And I think that even though people have been conditioned to expect that and to say, what's in the budget for me? And, like looking at, I think one of the most depressing things, I don't know if you find this as well, John and Charlie, but like looking at the way that the budget gets reported in the mainstream, like the ABC goes, winners, losers, you win here, you get a car, you get a car. And it's just sort of like, well, I think we all lose, and as much as fans have been conditioned to expect their sort of tax return at the end of financial year and their sort of, something they get out of the budget, what is in it for me? I actually think that properly prosecuted and properly explained, I think that people, much like small children, and John, I know you've got young kids, you might resonate with this, like they actually expect you to say no. Like, they're waiting for you to set a boundary. They're not expecting to be able to do everything they want all the time. And if you do give them that, they're incredibly disordered. They're not really getting what they expect and instinctively respond to. And I feel as though the Australian electorate, the Australian voters, are almost waiting for an adult to say no, to say, look, I'm sorry, we can't have this right now. Maybe in future, if we, tighten our belts a little or make some hard choices, we can, in time, afford something like this that would be nice. But I just think that we have a situation where no politicians, no parties, and certainly no politicians are actually telling people the hard truth and saying things that people might not necessarily want to hear, but that they nevertheless, intuitively in their stomach, they know it's true. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that. And I think that the first party and the first candidate that can convey that effectively, and I certainly hope to in my Senate campaign, work out a way to, I suppose, tell people. It's very counterintuitive politically. There was someone like Cos Samaras from Redbridge, he'd say, no, you've got to give people what they want all the time. You've got to follow the polling. My gut tells me that's not the case. And I think even people who are quite young, who are now growing up thinking this isn't what I was promised, I think they sort of intuitively understand that there needs to be something that changes. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
You made two excellent points in there. I've now forgotten the first one because the second one caught my attention. But on the second point you made there about leading reform, I saw an interesting interview with Ken Henry, former advisor to Paul Keating and Treasury Secretary, not in the libertarian wing of political philosophy. But he was asked the question, is it just harder now to get reform through politics because of the nature of politics, because it's more adversarial? And I thought his answer was very insightful. He said, look, it might be harder, but it's hard to tell because I think fewer people are trying. And he made the point that, you go back to Hawke and Keating and Howard, and it wasn't that suddenly everybody was clamoring to float the dollar and everyone was clamoring to sell the Commonwealth Bank. These were difficult reforms to get through, and political leaders had to go out there and prosecute their case and build support and say the unpopular things time and time again and spend political capital making a case for reform. We've now that says, I believe in reform, but only do it once it's already popular. But it'll only get popular once somebody prosecutes the case. So we've got a chicken and egg thing there. And so I think you're totally right there, Jordan. It goes to a broader point of lack of political courage that's just writ large across the Western world at the moment, which is why what we really need now is that injection of political courage and people willing to say the difficult things. I can't remember the first point you made, which was also great, by the way. And I totally supported that as well. Oh, no, actually, I do remember now the point you made about the budget media commentary, talking about winners and losers. It drives me batty as well. And if I can riff on that for a second, tax cuts. I work for the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I'm constantly talking about the need for more income tax cuts. It's something that I believe is very important for their country. But the case for income tax cuts, nearly everyone else, when they talk about it, says, oh, you'll get this much. I never say that. It's not the point. The point of tax cuts isn't you get a dollar, you get a dollar. You do, right? If you're a working person and there's tax cuts, you do get a dollar. But the reason it is so important for this country is cutting taxes will incentivize investment and innovation. We talked before about the importance of productivity, which is the only thing that can drive prosperity. How do you get productivity? We kind of know the answer to that. More and better investment and innovation, investment and innovation. And high income taxes stop both of those things. Income tax cuts will drive more of those things, giving higher productivity, giving higher wages, giving lower prices. But it's not a quick and easy, oh, you get $20 today, because that's not the point of it. That's not the point of good tax reform. The point of good tax reform is to create a more efficient economy with greater productivity growth, and rising waters lift all boats. But it's so hard to get that case through, because even when I'm making that point to a sympathetic journalist, they'll respond with, yeah, and how much does this person get? It's like, I don't know. That's not my point.
So just bringing up I just wanted to highlight the comment there from Pop Punk Guy joining us from X. So the comment or the question there is, what headline issues can you guys, the Libertarian Party presumably, although I should stress that Dr. John's joining us in his capacity as the Chief Economist of the ATA, rather than as a Libertarian, though he certainly is a Libertarian. And the question that's being asked there is, essentially what policies or what things can Libertarians do to appeal to left as well as right-wing sort of disenfranchised or disenchanted voters. And I think I would answer that question by saying that Rome wasn't built in a day. And if we look at the development and growth of the Greens as an example, their party did not sort of overnight become an 11 to 13% party. I think their last poll in Morgan, I think 13% is probably overinflated within the margin of error. But I think, you know, if you look at the sort of trajectory of the Greens, they grew in, you know, a couple of percent at a time here and there, and they sort of consciously targeted different cohorts and went through different stages of growth. My personal belief, so in the Libertarian Party, particularly amongst our membership, in Victoria, potentially more than Queensland and New South Wales, we do have quite a broad spectrum of people who join our party from sort of different walks of political life, I suppose. We've got people who might once have been environmental Greens voters or supporters, and we've got people who might have once been on the Labor right, and we sort of do, as a ideology, I suppose, or as a party, naturally kind of present ourselves as a sort of a home for the politically homeless, and we can appeal to the left in a way that other minor parties like FON and the UAP, when they existed, struggle to do. My belief is that at this federal election, I think that while we certainly will be seeking to frame our messaging in a way that doesn't alienate voters wherever they might lie on the political spectrum, I think that the way the tides of Australian politics are running at the moment, especially in a state like Victoria, which is where I'm the lead Senate candidate, I think that the next real sort of growth in our party, or the next kind of pathway to the percentage that I'm going to need to win a Senate seat, that 5 to 7% margin, I think that we are looking at that next step primarily being, you know, that sort of 1 to 1.5% disillusioned Liberals. The Liberal Party in Victoria is so weak that they are almost sort of on the verge of, you know, potentially ending up like the WA Liberal Party, where there was that old joke about fitting them in a 7-seat of Tarago. They don't think that could happen, but it absolutely could happen. And I think that a mix of that and the notional 4% that the UAP polled at the last federal election in the Senate, those kind of two cohorts are probably where we will grow from the 2.5% we got at the last federal election in Victoria in the Senate to the required 5 to 7% I need to get elected. Now, that's not to say that there aren't really important cohorts of voters who I think our message really appeals to. My experience of a lot of the people who have joined our party from the left of politics is that they have, I think, taken their measure of our party over time and kind of had that gradual internal realignment or journey towards libertarianism. I think it's hard to pitch a policy or a particular issue that shortcuts that process, at least so far. And I think the rest has to come down to what we do once we are in the Senate, once we do what we do, once we have representation. There's some things that are easier to do than say. And I think the way that our party can sort of carve out a unique position on issues that might appeal to people from the left who are looking for something different, I think that's something that's easier to demonstrate than to talk about. So I hope that answers that question. I thought it was a really good question. Sorry to sort of deviate from budget into politics briefly, although of course they're the same thing. So Nui Nomo says, Australian welfareism is in no way sustainable. It was designed on the presumption that the post-war boom, both in terms of economic and population growth, would go on forever. Stupid then, stupid now. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Humphreys?
The welfare system was certainly designed on that assumption of growth, although I'd hazard to say, I think it basically evolved because at each election, people worked out there was another big scheme they could propose to make them seem like the good guys at the election, get elected. And then we've got this one-way ratchet. It is so much easier to introduce a new government system than it is to remove one. One of the reasons for that, of course, if you have a government program and it doesn't work well, that's evidence that it hasn't had enough funding, so you need to give it more money. And if it works well, that's evidence that it's a great government program, so you need to give it more money. Whichever way you look, like once a government program is in the system, the natural inclination of it is to grow. It's very hard to then wind it back. So we've got this one-way ratchet, and every 5 or 10 years, some normally bureaucratic spark is able to then sell it to a politician and boost the size of the welfare state. I imagine no one sat down and thought to get to this end. Well, the Fabian socialists did, but I don't think most of the people that made the decisions, some of them were probably Fabian socialists too, but many of them were just people thinking, oh, how about the NDIS? You know, how about the aged pension? As you introduce each one of these policies, each one on their own isn't going to lead to a stifling welfare state. You add them all together when you never take them away, and we end up in this position we are today, where it is thoroughly unaffordable. And we didn't notice it was unaffordable before because of the reason that I don't know how to pronounce this person's name, Nenui. As they said, when we had a consistently growing economy and a consistently growing population, so that you had that population triangle, more people in the working age than the retirement age, when you had that system, we had the luxury of introducing what I would still say are bad policies, bad welfare state policies, and you could get away with it. And now, with the population pyramid inverting and productivity growth slowing down, we're starting to realize, wait a second, these policies aren't inherently sustainable. We've just been extremely lucky up until now. And look, I don't want to be too Cassandra about this, because one of my another thing that I get constantly annoyed with in politics is the pitch that the world is about to end. Quickly give a politician a lot more power so that they can come and fix you. Give the world is ending. Give politicians more money and power is the standard pitch you hear roughly every 3 years. You see it with COVID. You saw it with terrorism. You see it with drugs. You see it with whatever the big boogeyman is. Give more money and power to a politician, and they'll keep you safe. We're not about to implode into a descent of tyranny and starvation and communism tomorrow. But the trajectory we're on is not a good trajectory. If we just walk that path forward, we might get to the end of our lives being quite comfortable. But when do you want to make the smart decisions? When do you want to introduce policy that's sustainable and put your country on a good trajectory? Like only once it collapses? Is that the only time to start making smart decisions? Or do we look at where we're going, realize it's the wrong path, and today, when we have the capacity to sit down and calmly introduce reforms that make the whole system more sustainable, that seems like the right time to do it. The case I made in the New South Wales context, chatting with John Ruddock recently, is we're going to eventually have to fix many of these spending systems and the welfare statism. We've got the option of doing it carefully and sensibly today, or we wait till the system runs into a brick wall and then we have to do it in a haphazard way where it's being forced on us, and we're doing it sort of rushed and forced.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's the old saying, if the worst time to go shopping is when you're hungry. And I think that we are in many ways unfortunate because we have such a strong history of economic prosperity and stability and relative strength, and the ability to relatively quickly turn around deficits when the government sort of is so minded. I've seen people out on Twitter and other places say our blessings is that we can dig things up out of the ground, and that I think is true to an extent, and I think it kind of has it's a curse. We're lucky in one sense, but we're unlucky in another sense that we've never really had to make really difficult decisions to prosper. And I think if you look at countries like Argentina and others, like, we don't want it to get so bad that it's obvious what medicine is needed. And as you said, John, I think when Javier Milei was elected, it's like the harsher the medicine he uses, the worse the pain will be, but the quicker the recovery. But I think it's even more true to say that the earlier you use any kind of medicine at all, the less harsh it has to be to achieve those results. And so as a libertarian, as a libertarian Senate candidate, I think that really my job is to both explain the problem in a way that, like, the Greens, for instance, are very good at identifying the problems. We would agree with the Greens on a lot of what they say is wrong, in the sense that, housing is an issue. The two-party system is an issue. They identify quite accurately pain points, and the socialists are like this as well. They'll say, this is wrong. The system shouldn't be this way. You should be angry. We would agree, but the reasons or the causes for those problems are something we fundamentally disagree with, and therefore the solutions we need to propose are also different. I'm just going to bring up this comment here and say Australians are working less hard for more money. So, like, Bender, I understand what you're saying in terms of how that feels. It's not a criticism of everyday average Australians. It's the reality of government-enforced wage increases that are essentially arbitrary. They're not pegged to productivity. They're sort of just a central mechanism saying, this is what someone needs to be paid for doing X job. And at the same time as that, everything else goes up in price because there's no actual basis for that wage increase that would otherwise justify it. So essentially, you've got a vicious cycle where wages go up arbitrarily, and then that just gets passed on entirely to the consumer, because there's no point at which there's a a saving to be had. So it's just like pushing on a balloon. Push on the balloon and it expands in another part of the balloon. So when we talk about stagnant productivity, we're not criticizing individual Australians in any real sense. We're talking about incentives. We're talking about businesses and especially the corporate sector really not having any incentive to actually generate ways of working. And it can be technologies like we've been talking about, innovation, competition. So we're certainly not making a criticism of Australians. We're merely suggesting that governments essentially aren't even saying this is something we should be aiming for. So thank you for that comment, but I hope that explains it a little bit better. So I think we're reaching the point at the night where we will probably be winding up. I'd like to hear from both of my wonderful guests just your sort of final takeaways. What would you sort of say to people watching how things play out from here?
If I could coalesce, sorry, John, if I could coalesce the last few points so that, so one was the winners and losers, the other one was what can you tell the public, pump guy and the welfare. I'll coalesce all of these 4 points into one. Really simple. So when I first started working, my then manager goes to me, as you get better at your job, make yourself redundant. And that comment didn't hit me until a few years later. And it was basically get good at it and then move on to more important things. And that kind of like works towards the welfare issue where we've brought this policy in. We need to start slowly winding it back, and we don't need it as much because welfare shouldn't be forever. It should only be for a short time where you need a hand. What can you tell the Labor and Greens that might be disenfranchised? Tell them the truth. In this budget, there are no winners and losers. We're all losers. And why are we losers? Because whilst we're getting a little handout, the government's still taking so much of our taxes and not doing anything productive with it. It doesn't matter which way you look at it. Malay, when for him to get into as president, gave several years of him explaining, if I was president, this is what I would do. He hasn't changed the words that he's been saying. He's been a strong anti-socialist from day dot. He's been quite vocal about that. He's been telling them the truth and saying, look, I can give make all of these changes. It's going to hurt. But in 30 years' time, we will be a powerhouse. It's nothing new. I think the biggest problem that the journalists are finding is a politician or someone that got elected into politics that says what they're going to do and then does it. That's probably the biggest thing that we as libertarians could do is like, this is our policies. We've had them since inception. Let's make them more pragmatic and say, this, I will do this, we can do this, we can do this. And these kinds of discussions is one of those things. And I'm sure John will come up with some great points, but I think the most important thing is libertarian approach is we need less government, but we also need to stop feeding this bureaucracy that we have so that we can then start getting the tax cuts and not putting the emphasis on the less people, because we have an aging population. The people that are going to be working is going to be less and less and less. So the only result, if we maintain the welfare society or the policies that we have at the moment, it's going to result in increased taxes. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the next few years, we're certainly going to be seeing that. So we certainly need to change this ship, the direction of this ship now, or at least in the very near future.
Charlie, Dr. John?
Just wanted to give a shout out to a comment that came through a bit earlier from Rachel Asher. She points this out. I think it's a hugely important point, but it would take a whole live stream to really get into it. Sometimes it's framed as, can we afford this unsustainable welfare state? No, we can't. And people take that as, that's a shame because it's doing such good. It's not clear to me the welfare state is working towards its stated goal of actually helping those most in need. I think there is a lot to be said that family, communities, civil society, church structures, those sort of situations, those sort of institutions are much better at actually helping people get out of trouble, because there are people that always fall into trouble, and there needs to be solutions for those people. It's not necessarily true that it's a politician and a bureaucrat and an unsustainable, massive bureaucratic state in Canberra that is the only way to solve that. So I think that's a very important point about the need for welfare reform. You could end up with actually better well-being for those in need if you structure that welfare reform well and make the system more sustainable. But that's just responding quickly to Rachel. To wrap up my take on this budget, just going back to their beginning points, macroeconomically, it's a $30 billion deficit. We shouldn't have a $30 billion deficit at this stage of the cycle. That's a mistake. Having said that, it's not the end of the world. It's not that big a deal. It's disappointing. It's disappointing in the way you kind of expect a Labor budget to be disappointing. It's not about to burn the country down. I think the bigger problem is the lack of action. So the macroeconomics is disappointing but expected. The microeconomics perhaps also disappointing and expected, but this is the problem. We're going to have to start making the difficult decisions to make structural reform and to put the political system on a sustainable footing. And there's not a hint of that. There's a hint of going in the wrong direction towards ever more corporatism and picking winners. And that's the issue. If I was forced more stupid deficits, if they could start fixing the underlying issue, because if you fix the underlying issue, that's going to hopefully take pressure off the future budgets anyway. If you fix the macroeconomics but never fix the microeconomics, the deficit will just come back. So this is the lack of serious reform, and that requires bravery, political bravery. You need political smarts. That used to be a thing that was lacking, and maybe it still is in some parts. At this point, bravery is the missing ingredient that has a premium on it. So somebody that disagreed with me on half the issues, but was willing to be brave and make some progress on some of the issues, that is the person we need to get behind. I know Jordan is itching at the opportunity to be that person, and I know that, well, he's not right on 50% of issues. Jordan's right on most issues. Well, that's because we always agree, right, Jordan? But also has the bravery.
All the people might think, yes, we do.
And also the bravery to say it when other people don't want to say it, and the eloquence to say it nicely. So we need more of that. I wish you all the best when you're doing it. I hope there can be more than just you, Jordan. We need a whole series of brave people to become politicians, or politicians to become brave. One of those two things needs to happen to be able to drive the system forward. Thank you very much.
No, that's okay. Look, I couldn't agree more, and I think that just bringing up a comment here just while I sort of make my closing comments, because I think this is related as well. I think you can see the difference that a Libertarian voice in the Senate could make very quickly. You talked about courage, and the reality is that it doesn't matter how brave our Libertarian representatives are. Even if we had, 3 or 4 of us elected in the next election cycle, for example, we are some way away from being a party that can actually be in the engine room making decisions and contributing directly to the budget outcomes. But what we can do much earlier than that, and what even with one senator I believe we could do very effectively, is on some issues, and for both major parties, provide that covering fire, provide that bravery for difficult economic decisions in the same way that the Greens often provide an excuse for cowardice. They on the left often provide covering fire for the Labor Party to give in to their worst instincts on many issues. And I think that the Libertarian Party, if you look at, for example, what David Limbrick has at times been able to do in terms of suggesting economic policy and policy reform on a range of areas, we have the ability to deliver unique value propositions, to really put a lot of pressure, but also to give permission or to provide oxygen to people in the major parties who do fundamentally want to do the right thing, but are cowardly and aren't necessarily going to be the people who want to raise the issue. And we see this all the time, whether it's on polling booths on election day or in the interim time between elections. We have people from the major parties saying to us, geez, it's great work you're doing. We really agree. The Labor Party, the Labor right in particular, a lot of our economic policies have said, oh yeah, you guys are probably right, but it's a shame party discipline means that if I cross the floor or express the views you're expressing, I'll basically be exiled and my political future will be dead. And that's not necessarily going to change with the Libertarian voice in the Senate, but it just goes to show that we can advance and I think have a much bigger footprint than our actual parliamentary footprint is on the debate. I think that potential really is there. For my part, as John said, I obviously hope to be the voice and the candidate that returns us to federal representation in the Senate. I know we've sort of had steadily increasing viewers as the stream's gone on, and I'm sorry we're soon to end. Obviously, we don't know where everyone's joining us from, whether they're actually in Australia or not, or whether they're in Victoria where I'm running as a candidate or not. On the ticker tape down the bottom of this stream, you can see my candidate website at the libertarians.org.au/Vic Senate. And anyone who is in Victoria or who has friends or relatives who are in Victoria, I'd be much obliged and very grateful if you could put them onto me and follow my campaign page and my socials. And I really do think that we have a unique opportunity, we have unique positions, and we really can and must sort of return to federal Senate representation and start playing a more active role in federal politics. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining tonight. It's been a pleasure. I think that these kind of streams are something we're really keen to do more of going forward. And we'll look forward to sort of hearing from you and engaging with you in between now and the next federal election. Thank you very much again to Dr. John and Charlie and the people, supporters from the party behind the scenes who've been helping us moderate comments and helping get this stream set up. And one final note, if you'd like to learn more about me as a candidate or my sort of story in the coming days, probably tomorrow night, but most likely by the end of this week, I'll actually be appearing on A Current Affair. How they edit the stuff we did earlier in the week is in the hands of the gods, and we obviously have no control over that, but I think there was enough really good stuff in there that hopefully they'll give a balanced view. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Jordan, I think you need to say authorized by.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes, sorry, I'll do this. Sorry, this is important, given that I've just been plugging my candidacy. Authorised by Libertarian Party, Berkshire Docklands. There you go. Got to practice my fast voice. Thank you very much, everyone, and good night. And we'll look forward to a exciting year ahead, I think.
Thank you.